Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies through the Old Testament. After a very, very long time, we are finally back to the prophets. And as far as the prophets are concerned, I haven't been in this part of the Old Testament for probably, I was trying to calculate, it's been about 12, almost 13 years, going back to my days in California. And so it's taken that long to kind of get through the whole of the Old Testament. There's reasons for it. When I was in California, our Sunday nights is when we would do Old Testament, and we would take 1 week per month to observe and take a time for communion. So it took time away. We had other things that would happen throughout the year where Sunday evening studies were done differently, or I was out of town. So it wasn't it's not an exact 13 years, but it's been some time. So very much looking forward to going through the prophets with you. And it's very, very exciting to get to this point. I'm going to get into how I'm going to handle going through the prophets here in a little bit, and kind of just explain really on the first four, the first four prophets that are here, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel and Daniel, are what are known as the major prophets. So I'll get into major and minor prophets, especially when we get to the minors. I'll explain that. But because sometimes people just say it's because of the size of the book, but there are more chapters in Zechariah than there are in Daniel, so it's more impact probably as much as anything else. But we'll get into all of that. Really not important for where we are today. A couple of things very, very quickly. I'm recording this on Monday. What is it? The 13th or the 14th of September. Gosh, I'm getting my days run together. But anyhow, it's just days after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And of course, there's so much information out there on the internet, and especially about his religious affiliations, people that he did things with, statements that he had made, and the whole topic of Christian nationalism, dominionism, seven mountains, if you're familiar with those terms. So there's a lot of stuff going on around about that. And what I want to kind of do is narrow down some of those things and maybe get a little bit of clarity if we can. If you're not familiar with the terms and with Charlie and with people like him, I think that there's a lot of stuff that just gets very lumped in very big pieces that may not quite fit. So I want to go through and unwind all that. I think it's just really important that we take the time to do it. It's going to have a lot of impact going forward. So with that, we have a trip heading to Israel very, very shortly, in about a month and a week. Goodness, that's going to be here before we know it. And I do have room on the trip for very last minute people. If they have a passport, we'd love to have you come along with us. There's some really, really cool stuff that we're going to be seeing here. Things that are going to be different this time around than what we've done in the past. A couple of different locations, several different locations that we've not seen before. So if you're interested, contact me. And you can do that through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And there's an email there that you can drop down menu email. You can send that to me, and I will get that. I will also look there to any questions that you might have. I'll be able to answer questions if you have them, and would love to get a chance to interact with you if you have any questions about the ministry or topics that we've covered. One last thing, if you're a subscriber on the YouTube channel, great. If you're not, just hit the subscribe button. And the reason for that, you'll know when we're putting out content, which we do 4 times a week, sometimes more, depending on what's going on. So just to make you aware that we try to put out content all the time. And if you're a subscriber, you'll know about that. You'll know about it that way. It also helps with exposure. My reason for wanting to do this is to go through the entirety of the scripture and make people familiar with it. So with all of that, let's turn to the book of Isaiah. We won't look a lot at the text. I really kind of want to more go into what's actually kind of the layout of the prophets, what they're about, and just kind of almost like a kickoff to all of the prophets. So there are 4 majors and 12 minor prophets, but there's also some other things that we'll deal with when we get to the minor prophets, because it really all focuses around the the time of the exile that is really more conditioned on what happened in the south, the nation of Judah. So with that, let's have a word of prayer, and let's go ahead and dig into to the study today and into a little bit of the text, just to give us an idea of where we're going with this. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege that it is to sit at your feet, and the promise that has been given to us of the Holy Spirit, who will lead us in our understanding and the truth that is found here in your word. We would ask, Lord, that you'd glorify yourself through the teaching of your word today, and that each of us, as we take the time to study and to learn, that you would instruct us and help us to understand what it is that we're reading, why it's important, and what the prophets, what's the importance of us knowing these things today. So we pray, Father, that you would bless this time and glorify yourself in it. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, something I really hadn't planned on bringing up, and I don't have the article in front of me. And if you're interested, send me an email and let me know that you'd like to know where you can see this article. But there was something that came up. Gosh, it was I want to say it was September of 23, so about 2 years ago. I ran across this article I thought was really interesting. And when you talk to the Orthodox and you see what the Orthodox are doing in Israel and other places around the world, their focus is primarily on the first 5 books of Moses, so the Torah. So, of course, more importantly, even more narrowly defined to that, is the idea of corporate worship of the nation and the laws of the governing of the children of Israel. So the focus is on the Torah, especially the things after Exodus and the giving of the law, and those books that pertain specifically to the law and the things that came after it. That's very, very much the course of study. Of course, there's Talmud and other things that extra biblical writings that they take a lot of time to read and are familiar with. I suppose Psalms probably works in that as well. But when it comes to the prophets are something that is not necessarily, according to people that we've talked with when we're there in Israel, a couple of our guides, we've had this discussion, that in the religious institutions, the focus isn't so much on the prophets, and mainly that's because that's from a time of our history. It's not for our time. The Torah and the things of the law transcend times, but the prophets were written to a specific group of people for their offenses. They're different than ours. Interestingly, those same offenses are very easily carried throughout the generations, Jew and Gentile alike. So interestingly enough, there's a blind spot that they have towards the prophets, and the prophets are just incredibly messianic. One of them that we have here in front of us, Isaiah, as we study through this, has a number of messianic prophecies. In fact, one that we talk about when we're in Israel, in Jesus's base of operations up in the north, Capernaum. And we look at a few verses that are found in the book of Isaiah about Jesus being in Capernaum. And so it's very, very pertinent to his ministry, but there's so much else that we have involved with that. So there is really kind of the pivotal point in all of this. There is the exile. And the exile happens at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. The lion's share, if you will, of the prophets are dedicated to Judah and not as much Israel. And we're going to pull up a graphic here in just a moment that'll kind of help us to understand that just a little bit. But in that time of the exile, you have prophets that were writing during that time, and it's all agreed. Some would say Obadiah would be prophesying during that time. There's not consensus on that, but there's no doubt that Ezekiel and Daniel are writing during that captivity or that exile of the 70 years. Isaiah, though he was alive and doing what he was doing when Israel was still in the north, his ministry is to the south. And so really important that we understand the distinction between, are you a prophet speaking to the north, or are you a prophet speaking to the south? And we'll give some examples of different recipients, if you will, of these prophetic letters. Now, there were prophets before Isaiah who wrote, that's, the older ones, Isaiah, and there were prophets that didn't actually have anything written down by them, Elijah, Elisha, people like that. We know about them because of the records of the kings and those things. We have Nathan the prophet because of Samuel, and Samuel himself did the work of a prophet at times. So important that we understand that God was speaking through other people it is with the prophets that we have here by name that they became the ones that we have record of them by their writings, or in some cases there's disputing whether or not it was actually that person, but we do know we're hearing about them. So with that, we're looking at a time in their history when it's related to the kings. These are not prophets of the judges' times or anything before that. These are during the times of the kings. So it kind of goes through it all the way through the coming back of the captives in Babylon. So just before we get into all of this, let's remember what we have in the kings. The first three is it's Saul to David to Solomon, and when it's done with Solomon, when Solomon passes, the nation is split in two under Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam takes the northern tribes, including Simeon, who was in the south. The tribal allotment of Simeon was actually completely surrounded by Judah, but they sided with Jeroboam in the north. So the north never had a king governing over them who was any good. They were all horrible. And so you would have Elijah up in the north especially, and of course he's speaking to the nation. But at those times, there were a couple of prophets that were prophesying to Israel, telling them what was going to happen in the northern tribes, but they were absorbed by the Assyrians. The Assyrians would have come all the way to the south, and they would have taken out Judah. That's when we're going to get to Isaiah in the chapters, later chapters. During the time of Hezekiah, the Assyrians come all the way to Jerusalem, and I have no doubt would have absolutely conquered it had it not been for Isaiah and Hezekiah and how that was handled and beseeching the Lord for the deliverance of Judah. But it was only for a time. We do know that ultimately they were taken away, and the south was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. We're going to get to all of this as we go through the prophets. They're all going to be dealt with. So all of that takes place, and it eventually happens. Jeremiah is the one who tells us that when they're taken away in their captivity, it's going to last for 70 years. We'll deal with that when we get to Jeremiah. And then they return. And so it's during that exile that we again get the writings of Ezekiel and Daniel. But in that era of time also, and we'll probably incorporate these into the study, we'll see how far down the road that is. It's quite a ways. So it won't be like I'm doing it too soon. But what I did back in California at the time was that I looked at Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. They're put more with the historical books earlier on in the Old Testament, and yet they are from that time of the exile and then the return from the exile. So they're written more as historical books rather than, though the prophets are obviously covering the same history, but they're written from the one that God sends as the spokesman. So as time goes by, we'll get to all of those and kind of fill in some of those blanks as we start to jump into the text itself, and we'll work through all of that. So much of what we have in the prophets, both the major and the minor, is looking towards Judah and the forecasting of what's going to happen at the hands of the Babylonians, that the Babylonians would take them away into a captivity. They would be brought back from that captivity. And we see a lot of what took place there under the prophets that were writing at the time. But also, more importantly, what we also find in the historical part of it from Ezra and Nehemiah in particular. Esther happens when the Babylonians have been conquered by the Persians. Esther is in that time of the Persians, after they had defeated the Babylonians and before they were sent back into the land. That's where we pick up with Ezra and Nehemiah. And so that's when they start to rebuild Jerusalem that's been broken down. So it's going to be a really, really interesting. These messianic studies and these prophetic studies are absolutely amazing. And so I'm very much looking forward to sharing them with you. Now, as we begin, I want to take a moment to put up a slide so that we can start to look through some of these prophets and what they did and why they're important to us. So let me go ahead and pull up this slide right now, and it'll look through the kings and the prophets. Okay, as you look at this, you'll notice this in this slide, the first two that are mentioned there are Elijah and Elisha. And though they're not ones who are credited with writing a book as you see with Isaiah, what you do have is they're still ones who are prophesying during times of the kings. And you'll notice that both Elijah and Elisha are speaking primarily to the north because of the kings with whom they're interacting, and you can see their names that are there. And you can take a look at the approximate dates. Important that we see approximate there because, frankly, there's a lot of disputing, I guess you can say, as to the actual dates, and it's kind of almost circular. There's some events that might help to give a date, the reigns of the kings, if we know what those ranges of those dates are, and when the prophet would have begun to prophesy. All of that stuff is kind of left a little bit open. So you can see that this kind of works in a chronology going down, and let's face it, there is not unanimity on the dates of these things, and so there's disagreement on that among scholars. But really, when it gets to the kind of topics that we'll be dealing with, and the way that we'll view the prophecies, not going to be all that difficult to know the intent and who is being spoken to and why these things were being said. So if we want to think about Isaiah, interesting guy, you'll see that he's the first one that's mentioned here of the ones, and of course it would because of the age of it. He's one that is mentioned as far as speaking to Judah, but being alive at the time when all these things happened up in the north. Isaiah, his name is Yeshaya, and very simply means that just the translation of it is Yah has saved, or God has saved, or salvation of the Lord. That's what his name would be. Now, if that sounds a little bit familiar to you, when we think of Jesus in the Hebrew, you'll hear it pronounced or said Yehoshua, and that means that Jehovah is salvation, or Yah is salvation. Their names are very, very similar, and they sound similar, but ultimately they are just their names. In Jesus's case, obviously, it was intended for us to know that he is the embodiment of his name. Interesting how that whole thing works out. So as we look through this book, you're going to notice that as we go through it, it's speaking directly to Judah, and you could say that it's something that the nation should have heard. Israel in the north should have heard that, but he's going to address the nations, plural, of ones that God is looking to judge. So that will be coming up in it. He's going to have lots to say of idolatry once we get into especially into the chapters after the 40th chapter, and really kind of calling on the idea that these false gods that they had believed in had no ability to tell you of anything before it all took place. God would say, I stand in contrast to them. We'll get to that. There are tons of messianic chapters in this. There's the messianic chapter of chapter 7 about Jesus being born of a virgin. Chapter 9, where we hear about his government and that unto us a child is born. We'll get to that as well. And then there is the really big chapter of chapter 40, which is the proclaiming that John the Baptist uses about being the one who makes straight the way of the Lord. Now, this is 66 chapters, and it's a very, very interesting place where it breaks as far as the chapters are concerned. So 66 chapters, it's an interesting number when you think that there are 66 books in the Bible. And of course, you just kind of want to ask yourself the question, is there anything that might be gleaned from that? And the simple answer to it, as far as I'm concerned, is yes. And here's why. The first 39 chapters are dealing with God talking about judgments. And it really kind of culminates with the judgment that is pronounced that it will happen after Hezekiah. God has delivered Hezekiah, and through the ministry with Isaiah, the Assyrians are defeated. We'll be studying about that, and it's an incredible thing that takes place there. And yet, it's told that it's going to be a very grim future for Judah, and that's told to Isaiah and to Hezekiah. And so by chapter 40, there is a break, and it corresponds with a lot of what you see in the 27 books of the New Testament. So 39 chapters, 27 chapters, total of 66 books, and that break between the 39 books and the 39 chapters and the 27 chapters, beginning at chapter 40, are really interesting because chapter 40 starts with the pronouncement of Jesus the Messiah. So going from judgment to the deliverer, just in the break of chapters 39 to 40. And we'll develop all of that when we get there. If you've not heard that before, it really is a very fascinating thing. So as we look through these, you can notice that these different prophets, you're going to see who it was that they were writing to. And so most of the writing here in the first 4, you'll notice that the first 2 are to Judah, and then with Ezekiel and Daniel, they're to the exiles. This is during the time in Babylon. Of course, when it comes to Ezekiel and Daniel, they have much to say about things still future to our own day. But with Hosea, it is to Israel, and he's one of the few. And then, of course, so is Amos, written also to Israel. And then you have a couple of them that are dealing with nations that are not Israel. So you'll notice there when you look at Obadiah, that is going to be addressed to the nation of Edom, and we'll get into all of that when we finally get there. Of course, with Nahum and then with Jonah as well, you'll notice that is to Nineveh, what we might think is the capital of Assyria. So there are different people that are in focus of who will be talked to, but when you see the word prophet, very simply means nabi, and in the Old Testament, that's the Hebrew word nabi would be your prophet, and that's just one who speaks, the one who speaks on behalf of someone else. Now, in this case, we think of the prophets, and the prophets are speaking because God has sent them, and that's absolutely true. But there are also false prophets that are mentioned in the Old Testament as well. So you can tell who is speaking based upon what the prophet says. So you could have people that would say, "Thus says the Lord," and their prophecy, quote unquote, or what they're saying is invalid, and so they would be known as false prophets. But it's still the same word, nabi. So just for us to understand, when you see prophet, it just means one that is speaking for or on behalf of someone else. When we're reading the biblical prophets, as we are here, the ones that you see listed up there on the screen, you'll know that we're looking at people that God had sent, and he wants to speak to a specific audience. And really, it becomes a matter of there are things that God wants conveyed and communicated to people. There can be, maybe just said this way, there may be warnings, things that God wants them to know because there is grave concern that's going on. Consequence will be mentioned. If you don't, this is what will take place. In some cases, it's to the point where they're no longer even responding to God, so he just goes right to saying what's going to happen. And then in all of them, almost invariably, you're going to find that there is still, nonetheless, God gives them hope that after what he does in the way of judgment, that there will indeed be hope to those who have their eyes upon him and trust him. So interesting stuff. The tack that we're going to take as we go through each of these prophets, and you see them here listed, we're going to take the version of how you study this, and not everybody looks at it this way. Some people will study these chapters and they'll think all of it is really just historical. There's nothing future that's coming up. So they may take a literal view of it, but they say all of it's been fulfilled. And so anything that it speaks about is really more fulfilled in its perfection through the church. And so we're going to contest that wherever it's applicable as we look through it. I'm going to present it as it is literal with the things that he's saying. If there is a situation where you have an immediate fulfillment in their time or in the short future thereafter, we're going to make that application. So when God returns them to the land, that happened after the Babylonian into the Persian captivity. He brought them back into the land, but because of their displacement, there is still a future fulfillment of it. It was immediately fulfilled, though not perfectly. Amos is a great example in the closing verses of that book. They were brought back to the land, and yet they were displaced. So very, very important that we recognize how these books can have what's sometimes referred to as a near and a future fulfillment. So I'm going to teach it as literal, present, when it's happening there. But if there are elements of the prophecy that you say, you can say a partial fulfillment took place in their time, but the only way to make it work in its perfection, where nothing's left undone, is to say that God is going to future completely fulfill this. And we'll point out those ones when we get there. So we're going to take it literally that God is speaking of matters that are future and that are being prophetic, where God is saying at a particular time, these are going to take place. Zechariah is a great example in the latter chapters of that. Clearly, the things starting at chapter 40 in Ezekiel are that way. The latter chapters of Isaiah are speaking about millennial things. Daniel speaks about the Antichrist and the revelation of that. He speaks about what the things that happen in the book of Revelation covers. So we'll get to all of that. And then we will have also a literal application. If there is something that is being said in the prophets, though it's not speaking directly to us in the church, there may be things that happened that you can say it's just the nature of man or it's the nature of God, and here's the application to us. Though the scripture itself is not written to the church, it's written to the people who are the original recipients. We can just say, as we apply this, here is how it might apply as far as the church is concerned. So let me bring that slide down. And let's go ahead and take a look at a few of the things that we see in the first couple of verses here. And as far as Isaiah is concerned, what we're going to see right up front, it helps us in all of our understanding of where we're going to go from here, because verse 1 says this: the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So that tells us the primary focus that he's going to be speaking to here. The ones that are the recipients, Judah and Jerusalem in particular, and his interaction with the kings, you're going to see all of that, though there is so much more than just Isaiah saying to Judah or the kings, this is what's going on. Because he's speaking about so many things that happen after the nation no longer has a king. So remember, at this time, as he would be writing these things, there is the Babylonian captivity is on the horizon early in his life and in his ministry. Israel's still functioning in the north, but they're taken out by the Assyrians. So in his lifetime, the Assyrians have come and gone off of the world scene. The Babylonians are now the big people that are coming down and creating problems. And so as the warnings that he has here, the warnings are going to be really kind of fulfilled in the person of Nebuchadnezzar when they come. That's going to be much more the focus of Jeremiah. But the Babylonians are going to come and they are going to disperse the nation. They're going to take many of them back captive. Jeremiah and others escape. They get away. But ultimately they come back into the land, and they will have a couple of vassal kings as they're set up. But really, at the time that Nebuchadnezzar takes the nation, they don't have a king any longer, but nonetheless, they do have prophets that speak even after that time, but they have not been sovereign in the nation as a single unified people since the days of Solomon, 3,000 years ago until modern times. I believe it's important that we understand that and recognize it. But as we go through the prophets, it's going to be pretty obvious the people who are in focus, who is the audience of people, and the kings that are over them. There's an important part of understanding I guess you could say the reaction or the actions between the two. And if you haven't done so already, you can take the slide that I put up earlier of the kings and keep it handy as we go through these. It'll be helpful to you to understand writer, audience, date, all that kind of stuff. So, as we look through this once again, this is Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. And then verse 2, hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I have nourished and I have brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. So that sets the tenor for everything that you're going to see here. So if we understand that, he's going to have things to say to the nation, to Judah in particular, and Jerusalem, the nations who have oppressed, and the nations that God will have his say in what happens with them going forward in the future. And then he also, if the Lord has things to say, he's also going to promise to them a Messiah, a deliverer. Jesus will quote actually from Isaiah 61 when he's in Nazareth and speaking to them in the synagogue. He's going to quote from Isaiah 61. So there's so much interesting stuff that we see here, but this tells you what's going on. God is the one who speaks, and he's speaking to people who are rebellious. This is why God would send a prophet. He has things that he wants to address. He's going to tell them about things present. He's going to tell them about things future. And he's going to speak in such terms that it really broadens the scope throughout history going forward. Again, when you have prophecies about Jesus, Jesus is 700 years plus in the future from when these things are being written. So the idea that you have messianic prophecies, at least Jesus is quoting from Isaiah. Interesting how Isaiah will speak about Jesus and Jesus speaks back at what was said about him in Isaiah. It's just really, really cool stuff. So we'll get into all that. We'll take our time going through it. It's a long book. It's 66 chapters. It will take us some time to get through it. But these first two verses really kind of help you to understand. Who's Isaiah? Where was he? Who was he speaking to? During what time frame was it? And why does he need to say the things that he does? We're going to go back and look at verses 1 and 2 next week anyway. We're not going to, we're not going to just pick up at verse 3 next week. I want to make sure that we go through it. I have also wanted to make sure I've kind of, left myself enough time for the topic that I wanted to handle. I just wanted to do kind of a brief introductory, if you will, to our study through the prophets, both major and minor, and how we're going to go through them. One last thing, as we're looking through the prophets, the first four that are here, the major prophets, taken in succession, are fine. Isaiah was writing before Jeremiah. Jeremiah was writing before Ezekiel and Daniel. So I'm going to leave them just like they are. When we get to the minor prophets, they're not necessarily arranged in a chronological order, but I want to treat them in a chronological sense, mainly because I want to have the captivity from the time that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come and take them, and into the exile and the exilic prophets, though the minor prophets are not exilic, they're not during the exile, they're either before or after, but we can, that's when we'll bring in, at least if not all the way through the books, Ezra and Nehemiah, probably even Esther, we may very well deal with those, so that we're looking at it kind of in a timeline, because the prophecies and the things that are said after they're back in the land are really, very, very important to us, especially when we get to Malachi. But and of course, Zechariah is talking about future things, even at the return of Jesus Christ at the end of the millennium, or at the end of the tribulation. Some really super, super important stuff that's found in those. So I want to kind of take them in a chronological sense. So as we get to them, I'll make all that clear as we go along through this. It'll take us a little bit of time to do so. Now, as far as Charlie Kirk is concerned, and what we've seen take place, there's a whole lot of things that are being said, and a lot of observations that are made about him. And I want to kind of define some terms, if I could, because I think that there's a little bit of confusion in this. So when I talk to people, or when I see things that are posted, Charlie was obviously very, very political. And there's no question about that. And sometimes he would have interaction with people from all kinds of different belief systems within what is called Christianity, and some very, very divergent beliefs, depending on who it was that he was talking about. I guess it just, he saw them as useful for the cause that he was going through, because some of them, if he actually held the particular beliefs of some of these people, they're at odds with one another. I know at times he had spoken very favorably of Catholics, and other times he'd spoken very favorably about people that are very, very charismatic and have a really odd view of end times, or eschatology. So if he was really wed to any one of those views, you probably wouldn't have him crossing over and having anything to do with those people. So with myself, speaking only for me, if I was to be involved in anything political, and I don't think there's a problem with people of deep faith to have anything to do with politics. I don't have a problem with it at all. But if I were ever to get involved in politics, I can definitely tell you that there are groups that I would absolutely steer clear of, though we may advocate for some of the same things, like the right to life, marriage kind of things. But theologically, what they believe, aside from the common stuff, is so uncommon to me, I wouldn't want to kind of be attached to them in any way. In this case, we find a very, very glaring thing that many people look at, and that is what is known as, first of all, Christian nationalism, and then also a group within the Christian nationalists movement are people that have an eschatology or a view of the end times that is vastly different from mine personally. So there is a group within the Christian nationalist movement that would say, well, as far as the church is concerned, the church should restore us to a Christian nation. And I want to get to that in a little bit. We're going to look at a couple of quotes from a couple of founding fathers, and I think it'll help us to understand a little bit about where I think that the discussion gets all muddied up. But there are people here in the 21st century today who believe that God had promised that in the latter days, which they would say we're in, and I would agree, we're in the latter days, but not for the same reasons that they think. But they're saying we're in the latter days, and we've been promised by God that He will raise up a generation within the church that will have spiritual abilities and supernatural powers of prophecy and being sent by God, and we're going to take back control and arrest back the control from the godless people in the country, and we're going to restore a genuine Christian nation. And they believe that that's going to be done. Lots of signs and wonders. We would call them the charismatics or the Pentecostals, the people that are very, very hyper-charismatic. They believe that this is something that they're supposed to do. They believe that they have a mandate from God to do this. Now, inside of that group, we call them dominionists. And the thought behind dominionism is, at the very beginning, because of sin entered into the world, and dominion over the earth through Adam and Eve was forfeited, and it was broken, and now that dominion is held by the devil, who is able to do what he's able to do. God allows him to do it. But they believe that they're going to take back that power that was broken, and they're going to take back the dominion over the earth. And so they believe that it starts here in the United States, and they have what is known as their 7 mountains. And the 7 mountains just basically are things in the culture. So it's religion, it's academia, it's the media, it's the schools. And so there's 7 of these mountains that they say that under this supernatural power, God is going to use us, these dominionists, to take back all of that control that's been given over to the devil, and we're going to conquer him. So that's their eschatology. They believe that as part of the end times, this is what God is going to do, and no one can stand in their way. They have all this power. Now, they've been saying this for 50 years, and they've been failing miserably in this, of course, because they're wrong. And they're wrong because the Bible doesn't say any such thing. They just make such a mess of the prophetic passages that God is going to do some things in the future. But boy, they read so much nonsense into it. So if you talk with a person who is absolutely wed to that eschatology and they're sold out for the cause, that's why we've got to be involved in politics, we have to be involved in media, have to be involved in education, we have to be involved. I don't have a problem with outspoken believers being involved in any of that stuff, but to think that we're going to, quote, restore the nation back to being a Christian nation doesn't even understand our foundings. And that becomes the problem. And when I pull up the quotes here, you'll understand what I mean by this. So, because Charlie was involved with many of these same people, I don't know how much he understood of their theology. Because I don't know, I do believe that when I read the things that he says, that he believed the basics of what we would consider as Christianity, and he was a good spokesman for some of those things. It was his affiliations that really muddied the waters. And that's why you have a lot of people who are very, very critical of him because of his affiliations. And so part of those affiliations, he would do stuff in the political sense with these 7 mountains people. Now, I've never heard him say anything that would indicate to me, and there may be a video out there I just haven't seen, but I've never heard him articulate a 7 mountains where the supernatural sons of God with special endowment of powers, and we're going to take back and create basically what they think is just about a theocracy, means God's going to govern the United States of America. It's going to be God who does that. So that would be a theocracy, and there are some in the Seven Mountains group that really believe that that's going to be the case. But it's nowhere near what we had in our founding, and that's going to become clear here in just a moment. When I think of Charlie, I think of a guy who very early on, shortly after high school, realized that college was not something that he wanted to do, but he wanted to reach that group of people. So he was very, very involved politically and had been all the way up to his last day here on earth with us. But over time, he's going to, by definition, he's going to start rubbing elbows with people who are very much of his political stripe, believes all those very same things, and he's going to begin, as you see, you'd see he developed his beliefs in a biblical sense, and they really became much more sharpened over time. And I still don't know if he really fully grasped what the Seven Mountains was all about and the depths of what is dominion theology. How much of it he knows, I cannot say. Again, I haven't seen anything where he discusses it with any real level of understanding. But I did see him rub elbows, like I say, with an awful lot of people with very, very different views of everything. So I saw him, talking with just mainline, down the middle evangelicals, saw him, doing things and saying very favorable stuff about interviewing and interacting with Catholics and hopeful about the Pope and all that kind of stuff, all the way down to things that he would do of speaking with these very charismatic Seven Mountains dominionist kind of people. I just don't know if he had a blind spot for it, didn't really fully understand it. Again, if he did really fully understand it, that's problematic because, again, he's viewing the world in a way that I don't think even exists. But I tend to just think this is a kid who is very, very involved politically, no doubt about it. And there were a number of people that he was interacting with that, boy, I wish I knew him personally. I would have had a lot to say about those people and say, you're welcome to go ahead and attach yourself to them, but just realize that, like you say, you lay down next to a dog, you'll wind up with fleas. That's kind of where I think that would have been headed. So let's get back to this idea of a Christian nation, because a video was sent to me. It really was the reason why I wanted to do this. And the question was asked of him about being a Christian nation. And it's an interesting thing. His answer, if I were the person that was asking it on the microphone, I think the guy asking the question was pretty much off his rocker on some things. But I also think that Charlie missed an opportunity with some of his answer by quoting what Jesus talked about, or what the Bible talks about as far as being the ecclesia. And so the ecclesia means the government. And so his answer there, I thought, was incorrect. Ecclesia in the Greek just simply means, you'll see church is usually the way that it's translated, but it means a gathering. And it's a gathering of people, as Charlie even said, of a governing. And so, okay, even if I'm going to use his term of governing, that's fine, but it's not a governing. The church is not governed by the state. The church is governed by Jesus. He's the king. So in this case, the church is a monarchy, if you will, Jesus being the king, we being subjects of that kingdom. And so we advance accordingly. But we're not told that we are supposed to be a theocracy. We're not told that we're supposed to be a government rather that is absolutely like we had with Israel. They were a theocracy. God said, "You are my people. This is how you will be governed." They, of course, rebelled against it, but that government was put down in the law, those books of Moses. Here's what you can do. Here's what you cannot do. If you don't do these things, or if you do these things that are prohibited, here's the consequence. It's all laid out there in black and white. We have no such thing like that as far as the founding is concerned. But that brings up some really, really important matters for us to consider here. So going back to our founding, I want to bring up a slide here with two quotes. And if you were to look at just these two quotes alone, they're very, very telling. They're very important for us to understand. But if you start to read through the entirety of the founding documents, and especially when it comes to the things that Madison and Hamilton and even John Jay, who I'll be mentioning here in a moment, wrote what are known as the Federalist Papers, you're going to get an idea of how they thought we should be governed, and these were men of very deep faith. So it's an interesting thing. Could you have a government that was very much dominated with people that at very minimum had a moral worldview that was much more of the biblical sense than it was the secular. Go read their writings. It's really not a difficult question to answer. So, but does that mean that they wanted a theocracy, a God-governed people, and they were going to put a system in place that would ensure that? And you can see that that's obviously not what they were intending when they put it together. So let me bring up these quotes because I think that they're incredibly important and they really kind of speak to where I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding. Now, the first of these two is, it's written by John Adams. Now, John Adams was our second president of the United States, and this was right after the drafting of the Constitution itself. And in this letter, it's dated October the 11th, rather, of 1798. It was written to the Massachusetts militia. And if you go read the entire address, just look up this. Just look up John Adams, October 11th, 1798, to the Massachusetts militia. You can read the entire address, and it's making the case that really is kind of encapsulated just in this one particular statement. And it says, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Now, when you read the rest and the body of the text, you'll realize what he means by this. That the Constitution itself is given so that people would have the maximum amount of freedom. And with that kind of freedom, if they are not people who are moral and religious, given that kind of freedom, it can be absolutely devastating to the country. And so the idea that people would have something that afforded them a tremendous amount of freedom, and yet if there's no governing principle in their own lives, that's a problem. So what should that governing principle be? What we would consider as the Christian or the Judeo-Christian work ethic and worldview and all those kind of things. So how it is that you interact morally, religiously, is going to influence how you react in a country that gives you enormous freedoms. And the freedoms that they would have had versus what we have now are night and day. But nonetheless, when you compare us to most countries on earth, you're still freer here than you are in most anywhere else in the world. And even when you start to think of Europe, look at the things that people are being put in jail for in Europe by just saying things or writing things. It hasn't happened here yet, not to anywhere near that extent, but you can see where it could. So here's what John Adams has to say. Again, this is before you even get to the 19th century. This is at the end of the 18th century, 1798 to be specific. So he says, "Our Constitution was developed in mind that the people who live here have inordinate freedoms unlike anywhere else on the planet. And in order for people to be governed with that amount of freedom, if there's no morality and there's no religious instruction, there's no belief in God and, conducting yourself in a manner that's indicative of that belief, it's going to get really, really ugly." That's his concern. So if you think about this, and we think, well, that's unrealistic, that's this and that's that, it's ridiculous, you can't expect that to be functional. Let's remember in 1789, it was shortly thereafter that they did a census in the country, and there were estimated to be somewhere around 4 million inhabitants or citizens of the United States, 4 million. Now look at the demographics of who those people are. Again, mostly European settlers that had families, but we know that they came here mainly to get rid of religious oppression, and there was a lot more freedom. Now, again, some of the things that they believed back then were pretty wild, pretty different. Again, you had a lot in the way of slavery, but what you notice with the two people that I have mentioned here, John Jay and John Adams, these are two of the most prolific abolitionists that we've ever had in the country. And the Constitution itself gave the ability for that kind of freedom to be realized. That's why the best abolitionists on the planet were here in this country, wanting to undo what was being done all over the world. And ultimately, it happened here in ways that are different than anywhere else in the world. The Constitution allowed for such a thing. So when John Adams would say this, read his other writings, especially John Jay, the guy that we're going to read about next, was an avid avid abolitionist, hated the idea of slavery. He was the first Supreme Court justice appointed to that position and resigned it so that he could become the governor of New York and ultimately sign the law that forbade slavery in the state of New York. So interesting people. Boy, when you start to read what these guys had to say, they were profoundly interesting people. Now, by the time that we read this next one, the population of the United States in 1813 would have been somewhere between 8 and 9 million, is what we're thinking. Now, why I mentioned how many people live here? Again, the difference between when one was written and the other is about 24 years. And the demographics of the country had not still changed very much. So you have mainly European settlers who had come here. These are people who were, quote, religious, as they would use the term. And so that's still going to be the lion's share of the population. I was reading one letter from John Jay, and he had talked about there were only 2 times that he could ever remember speaking with somebody who was a proclaimed atheist. And so that was a rarity in their times, let alone the idea of different, quote, religious beliefs. So fast forward to our time, we have anywhere, depending on who you ask, from anywhere from 330 to 350 million people in the country, as opposed to what I've just given you as the numbers here. And the demographics are radically different. And what we've had in that change of demographics is also many, many more different views of reality, of religion and of morality, much more humanistic, much more atheistic, much more different religious views entirely. So the things that were said by these men back then don't work so well to our day because the population of the United States is radically different. So notice what John Jay has to say here. He says this. Now, providence, that's just a way of saying that God, in his will and by his design, providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers. That's what the Constitution gave to them. Now, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and the interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. National prosperity can neither be obtained nor preserved without the favor of providence, or without God's favor. So when he talks about being a Christian nation, he's a very, very intelligent man. This was the first Supreme Court justice that this country had ever had. So when he mentions it as being a Christian nation, he knows full well the Constitution does not call for a theocracy. So what you had is a secular government, but the people who made up the population were primarily Christian, and you would find that in their writings, in their dealings, and how they viewed the world. So you could have a nation that was secular, but it was dominated by people of a Christian worldview. So back to what we see with John Adams, our Constitution was meant for people with a religious backbone, and with that as being their support, and that would be the thing that would help them to self-govern. And if they couldn't govern themselves through religion and morality, then we would have a real problem, because we would get everything other than a biblical worldview dominating why we do what we do. So you don't find this incompatible. And for those people that say, well, there's a separation of church and state, well, tell it to John Jay. So these were men of deep faith, and they were highly involved. And so John Jay, again, these are founders. These are the guys who were there at the inception of the country. John Jay being the first Supreme Court justice, the governor of New York. These are highly influential political figures who are also men of very deep and abiding faith. So how do you reconcile these things? And let me bring down this slide, and we'll close this out. So when we think about a Christian nationalist, or a person who wants to see the nation governed in a sense where Christian beliefs are kind of dominating, I can see where some people would have a real problem with that. I have no problems saying that I would much prefer to see a person in office who shares my view biblically than somebody who rejects those things and would work against it. So does that mean that I'm a Christian nationalist? Well, my hope's not in the government, and I don't want to see a theocracy. I don't want to see a government that mandates to me what it is that I have to believe in a religious sense or on matters of faith, because ultimately that can be taken over by some really bad people. And we have examples of that all over the world when the dominant religious belief of a particular country dominates everything, even to the way that society reacts and interacts. The founders had this interesting dilemma. Were they then to produce a nation that would make it easy for people of religious belief to function and have freedom, but not mandate that you have to believe this and we, the government, say so? They found that great balance. They looked in the nation at people who were of a Christian orientation and view of the world and belief, and they gave them an inordinate amount of freedoms, unlike anywhere else in the world. And the nation did well. They were able to overthrow slavery, especially in the North. That happened much, much earlier than it happened in the South. We fought a civil war over it, but the Constitution afforded that, trying to get away from the way that the world was to the way that it is. Now, people can go ahead and debate that when this is not about slavery, but you can just, again, if that's a branch of the history that you want to look at the abolitionist movement and look at how it was done as much as they could in the governmental sense until finally society figured it out. But unfortunately, even at that, there were people who resisted it. But as far as the Constitution is concerned, and the way that the government is comprised, the founders realized full well they did not want to institute a theocracy. What they wanted to do was give people the maximum amount of freedom, recognizing who it was that made up the country. And at the time, the country was made up primarily of people coming from the same part of the world who had the Christian belief of what the Bible teaches, Old and New Testament, and it influenced everything that they did in their lives, and it certainly influenced much of the way that they put together policy as far as the country's concerned. But it was, again, for all of this time, all the way up to the writings that you had here with John Jay, this was before the nation even had 10 million people in it, and they were all pretty similar by comparison to what we have now, with 330 to 350 million different people from all over the world with all manner of different beliefs, much of which is very, very secular, very, very humanist, and of course looks nothing like the founders. So watch any politician, listen to anything that they have to say, and even the ones who are like on a policy level going out of their way to put their thumb in God's eye will, when it's appropriate for them to do it or when they think that it's helpful, they'll quote the Bible until they turn blue in the face. They don't believe a word of it, and they're doing it just because it's a political means to an end. And it's pretty despicable, but it's what I would expect. And it's what you would have in a society that doesn't mandate religion, but affords a great deal of freedom. People can say any variety of things, and it's why when we look at the world around us, why is it melting down the way that it is, and especially in our country? People have still an inordinate amount of freedom compared to the rest of the world. And if the people who have that amount of freedom are not governed by something above themselves, in this case, God saying, this is what I would expect of you, this is what I would not expect of you. If they don't govern themselves by something higher than themselves, you're going to get exactly what we're looking at. And the amount of hatred and the amount of anger that is expressed towards people like Charlie and others, I don't know that it gets any better. Again, when I look at the Bible, I don't think that the world is doing really, really great when the Lord returns. That's not what we're told. So, to put a nice little finishing touch on this, as far as Charlie is concerned, I can't speak to exactly how much he knew about the various beliefs of the people that were around him. It seems like he had his hands pretty full with a whole lot of other things. But I think if he really had genuinely understood who it was that he was interacting with, he may not have wanted to lend as much of his own personal, capital in doing things with them, because I believe that in a lot of ways they were pulling in a very different direction. And I think that there were times where he was just very useful to their ends, but they were not on the same page. So if in the best case scenario, he may have been very much naive to these things. So if you've got videos and things where you can see and you've noticed that he said things very, very favorable and really could express and explain the theology behind the seven mountains and dominionism, that he was in agreement with it, by all means, let me know and send it to me. But once again, I think people like him, and who knows where it goes from here. All the things with Turning Point will be very, very interesting to watch as they go forward, and how much I think organizations like that, because I have heard a number of other people from Turning Point who clearly are not in the know when it comes to major biblical themes, let alone theologies, that may very well have people hitch their wagons to them because they have the ability to advance the movement, but not even understand who is really behind them and what is their belief in the theological sense. Very, very interesting things. 6 months from now, a year from now, who knows what we're going to see. But very, very interesting times. If you have any questions on any of this, the trip to Israel, the topics that we did here, the introduction to the prophets, contact me through the ministry's website, Old Path Theology, and I'd love to have a discussion with you. If you have any questions on it, we will pick up with the book of Isaiah next week.